NovelTea Show, the podcast where we spill the truth about the ups and downs of writing and the ins and outs of the publishing industry. I'm Kat.
I'm Lainey.
I'm Alexa. And this is episode 3, Plotting versus Pantsing.
We'd like to start this episode by thanking our patrons for voting on this topic, and stay tuned to the end of the show where we'll answer our Patreon question of the week.
So today we have a very juicy topic of pantsing versus plotting. So I think we want to start off with a little bit of a definition. So Alexa, what is pantsing?
Oh, I feel so called out and also seen. I get this question a lot. Plotting, I feel, is better understood than pantsing. But pantsing, in a short definition, means that you fly by the seat of your pants as you are writing. It's the idea that you don't plan ahead of time. You kind of figure it all out when you sit down to write.
Well, I think plan ahead of time is not exactly correct, because pantsers usually do have a vague plan. It's more about like specifically outlining and like getting more into detail about like what happens in the plot. Like pantsing is figuring it out while you're doing it, whereas plotting is figuring it out ahead of time.
Well, that's the very heart of this debate, I think, is that I don't find any of the terms, the popular terms we use, to be exactly ideal for kind of describing these different schools of thought. And even to think of them as different schools of thought, while there is a very clear divider, I think that, and we've discovered this as writing friends through discussing our processes, that why can't we all just get along? I feel we all have way more in common than we think we do. Right. And that no writing process is perfect or right, but yeah, in a nutshell, pantsing is the opposite of plotting and outlining.
So yeah, I think it's less about plotting versus pantsing and more about where you fall on the spectrum.
I never heard of plotting versus pantsing until I started doing NaNoWriMo. And in the beginning of that whole debate, yes, I was like, this is totally a debate. But now, like, the more I start writing, the more I really don't like either of those terms to describe someone's writing process, which I will get into a little bit later. But for the purposes of these terms, I guess I'm considered a plotter, but I really don't like the terms.
Right.
Well, let's talk about outlining versus not outlining, because I think this is the soul of the issue. And we can certainly say we do fall into two camps here, whether you outline ahead of time versus not outlining ahead of time. And I loathe outlining. I will fight against it at every turn.
I love outlining. I do it in my sleep. I dream of outlines.
I feel like that's your brand, Kat.
It kind of is. Yeah, we're gonna jump into it in a second here. But let's start off, because it is kind of a spectrum and it does vary so much per person. So let's talk a little bit about how much outlining you personally do or do not do pre-writing.
I do outline, and I feel like the way I outline evolves with every book I do. My first book, I did a half a page outline. It was just every point of where I was working towards. Because what I discover is that I really can't quote unquote pants novels, because I usually quit. If I don't know where I'm going, I quit. And then those are novels in my computer that I've never finished because I never knew where I was going. So for me, the most important thing is to find a direction of where I'm headed, and that is what I need to do. With later novels and the current novels that I'm writing, they are a little bit more intensely outlined, but not as intensely as I feel like Kat outlines. I mostly outline by act. So I'll outline an act and then I'll write that act, and then I go back to the drawing board and outline the next act before I start writing it. And I do that for 3 acts because I work from the 3-act structure.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, is it always 3-act structure, or?
For me, yes, because it's just easier for me to frame a story that way.
Right.
Yeah.
See, I mean, I have some opinions about structure where I think 3-act, 4-act, 5-act, it's all actually the same. because like the story plot points are all in the same general areas. It's just like how you divide the story. So like you can do a 3-act story that is evenly divided, or a 3-act story where, you know, it's 25%, 50%, 25%. But that kind of 3-act can also be easily divided into 4-act by just doing 25% for each section. So yeah, I think that the plot points stay the same no matter what, and it's just kind of how you feel the acts divide.
Yeah, and I think because I evolve with every with every project that I work on, I evolve. So, I mean, 3 books from now, I could be doing like a 7-act structure.
Right.
I don't know. But right now, for me, the easiest is just like 3 acts, just outline it that way, and then you're good to go.
Right.
Y'all are talking about structure too much. I'm breaking into a cold sweat. I don't like it. Which is to say, oh gosh, outlines. I'm the pantser in the room, so I'm representing that side. However, as we all know, I have been trying to outline my current project because it is a genre that begs for greater structure and pre-planning. So it is true. The process evolves with different books, but what I discovered with this one, probably the core of why I can't outline, which is I cannot figure out a second act without writing Act 1. And even if I've written Act 1, Act 2 still, it forms on the page as I write it. I think my pantsing process is the most critical in Act 2. So how much do I outline? Almost not at all. On my average project that isn't this current one, I know my inciting incident. I know kind of the first twist, which is usually what propels the character into Act 2. I know kind of something exciting that happens around the middle. I call it the midpoint turn. I don't know if that's a real thing. And then I usually know something that's going to take the characters into Act 3, even if I don't know exactly what it is, but I know an emotional turning point that'll happen toward the end, and I know more or less nothing else. And that excites me. But with this new one, I actually did outline Act 1, and I outlined Act 3, and then I failed at outlining Act 2. Mm-hmm. It basically was a bunch of bullet points, and they were all questions. She goes here, they do what? I literally had a bullet point that just said investigating stuff. That's not an outline, for the record.
Well, Act 2 is a beast in its own.
Right. And I don't know, when I do my initial 27-point outlines, which sounds like a lot, I'll explain that in a moment. Some of my points are just like they investigate or they fight, they argue, something like that. So like I won't have any idea of like what the setting is, what exactly they're arguing about, or how exactly they're investigating. I just know that like that's the general thing that happens there.
Well, why don't we talk about your 27-point outline? Because you are the patron saint of outlining on this podcast, and I give you the floor.
Oh boy. Well, I have several videos on my channel that break it down in a little bit more detail. We can link those in the show notes for any listeners who are interested in a more detailed take on this. But basically, I love thirds, beginning, middle, end, stasis, interruption of the stasis, and a struggle to regain a new stasis. And that sort of story pattern just cycles throughout an entire story. So I typically outline in a 3-act structure, though, like I mentioned earlier, I think that acts are kind of fake and don't really mean much. It's just like where you want to divide the story, where natural breaks occur. Like some of my stories have stayed in a 3-act structure, but my current project, I initially outlined in 3-act structure, and in writing it, I realized that it really divided more nicely into quarters. So I'm writing in a 4-act structure, even though I started with the same 3-act, 9-block, 27-point outline that I always use. So yeah, acts are fake, but...
Fake news. And we will have links to not only Kat's 27-point outline video, but any other kind of resources we mentioned are going to be in our show notes, which you can find on our website, NovelTeaShow.com.
Yes. So yeah, back to the 27-point outline. So I start with a 3-act structure, and then I divide each act into its own beginning, middle, and end. So there are 9 blocks, which I essentially operate in like a 30 to 50 page section where like we're accomplishing a certain story beat. So for example, the first block of a story involves the inciting incident and the build up to the inciting incident and the immediate reaction to that inciting incident. The second block involves a longer term reaction to that inciting incident and the protagonist taking action after they have reacted to what initially happened. And the third block involves the consequence to that action, the first major plot twist, and the push into Act 2. So it's all very vague story beats, but I break each of these 9 blocks into another section of thirds for a total of 27 plot points that are, again, very general and can apply to any type of story, whether it is contemporary, high fantasy, thriller, no matter what. Stories tend to follow a basic pattern. And what this outline is just a very basic general pattern. And I don't often know a lot of it ahead of time. Like, I will often only like thoroughly outline the first act, and then much like Alexa said, I will know the midpoint turn and the beginning of the second act, and then the third act, all I'll really know is that plot twist that breaks into the third act, and the ending is just a big question mark because I need to know more about the characters and their emotional journey before I can get into specifics in that final act.
Well, but you bring up story beats, and I think this is something important to talk about, because this is another outlining method that a lot of people find useful, and I shall even admit, as a stubborn pantser, that I find story beats very useful. I don't like being pinned down by them. I don't like sitting down and outlining using them, because I have tried that. We'll talk about all the different ways I've tried to outline and how they've all failed. And this is how you figure out whether or not you are a pantser. You try. And the big one is the Blake Snyder beat sheet. This is kind of dogma in the screenwriting world. Save the Cat is the book that Blake Snyder wrote on screenwriting and story beats that almost every working screenwriter now uses. It's everywhere. And there's actually a companion version that was released last year called Save the Cat Writes a Novel that can be really useful to novelists. It's been adapted by a novelist, Jessica Brody, who adapts some of the beats to work better for long-form fiction. And I find, even though I didn't like Save the Cat, the book, it annoyed me on so many levels. However, I liked identifying the beats. I like some of the snazzy names for them. I like the way that they challenge me to think about key emotional moments in stories that I like. And I've been able to adapt kind of those names for them and beats to work for my method. And I do think there's extreme value in writers educating themselves on story beats.
Right. When I was developing my 27-point outline, I researched a lot of different outlining methods. The Blake Snyder beat sheet was one of them. Also, there's a 7-point outline method that I've seen talked about quite a bit. The hero's journey, just like a lot of different outlining methods. I studied them and I tried to figure out one that worked for me. And I came up with this 3-act, 9-block, 27-point outline.
Isn't another one the snowflake method?
I've heard of that one. It's a little too.
I took one look at it, and I started to cry.
Yeah, it's a little too intense for me. Like I wanted like numbered beats. Like that was a little too vague for an outlining method for me. Like it's too vague for outliners, and it's too outliney for pantsers. So.
I think the next project that I try, I really want to outline it in a way that is using the Save the Cat beat sheets, because what I've discovered, and I'm just wondering this more as an experiment type, but I find recently that I've been rewriting a lot in my revisions. And not that you don't rewrite when you do revisions, but I'm doing like entire acts where I just axe out what I did and restart it. So I'm wondering if the next time I try to start a project, if I outlined it more in a way that matched up with beats, I wonder if it'd be easier in revision.
And I think we all would advocate experimenting and trying different things. So my big thing with pantsers that I encourage them to do is always to try outlining, to try more than once, because sometimes it's finding the right style of outlining that works for you, and sometimes it's trying multiple of them and discovering, oh no, I cannot do this. But there is no do without try. What is that Yoda
there is
quote?
No try, only do.
Yeah, sure. But meaning, I think there's always value in trying different things with different books, like me trying to outline my thriller. I think that'd be really interesting, Lainey, and kind of to see how it goes for you. I assume you'll vlog it.
Yeah, I was going to say, please vlog that and report
Yeah,
back on how it goes.
I'd be curious myself to see how that goes.
Lainey, can you tell us a little bit more about your outlining process? Because you do a lot of pre-writing, don't you?
Yeah, I do a lot of pre-writing, which is anything before you actually start writing, for those who don't know. I do extensive brain dumps.
Right.
And those really help me try to figure out what this novel could be, if this idea can sustain an entire novel-length type of story. And I really love the pre-writing stage because it's all fresh, it's all new. It lets me explore different things I want to kind of see in the story, whether that be relationships. Relationships are my favorite part of the story, but another thing that I do is I create story Bibles for my projects. And I have 3-ring binders that I include all of this different stuff in it, and it really helps me after I write the first draft. I go back to that and I write out everything that I know for sure I want in the story. A huge part of that is like history of the world, world building, characters, magic systems, because I write primarily YA fantasy.
Yeah, the pre-writing and outlining stage is probably my favorite stage as well. Like, I love it because it's when the idea has so much potential and could go in any direction, and the idea is still kind of developing, but also I have this ideal in my head of like the perfect story it could be, and it's all before I start actually writing, and then I ruin it by writing it. But then you do a lot more writing and a lot of revising, and you fix it and you try to get it as close to that like ideal, perfect, shiny story that it could be. But yeah, I love the pre-writing outlining stage because it's all about potential.
And see, I just can't do that much pre-writing work. This is a huge part of the pantsing for me, where if I overthink characters, for example, or even world, I need a base. I need enough to go off, but if I do too much, I psych myself out and I lose interest in the story, or I allow myself to be overwhelmed by all of the questions. There's so much to develop, and I am more likely to abandon the project idea if I am doing too much planning ahead of time. And for me, that's a huge core of the plotting versus pantsing for me as a writer, discovering that as long as I have essentially a backbone, which is those key things that I know, like Inciting Incident and Midpoint Turn, and a character's emotional journey, I do have to pin that down for my main character. And I have to have key kind of romance scenes in mind, because I also love writing for the relationships, like Lainey, that as long as I have that, I have just complete confidence that I'll discover what I need to discover in the story and the characters and the conflict as I'm writing.
I will say that even outlining, I experience a lot of that as well. Like, my story constantly evolves and goes in different directions, sometimes very unexpected directions. But I sometimes I will completely throw out my outline for the second and third act. I'll write the first act and I'll be like, oh, this is a different story. We're going in a completely different direction. And I have no problem throwing away a complete outline and starting a new outline from scratch.
So I feel like in that sense, you are way less rigid than some outliners are.
Yeah.
So...
And I think I'm way less rigid than people think when they first hear that I have a 27-point outline method. They're probably like, whoa, that's intense. Like, how do you know that much stuff ahead of time? And I'm like, no, it's really not as strict as you might think. It's just a very basic skeleton of a story that you can, you put the flesh and the soul and everything on top of that.
I'd be super curious to pick the brain of a truly hardcore rigid outliner, because I am very curious about kind of how that works, because to my mind there would be just such enormous pros and cons to that writing style.
I mean, I am a big fast drafter, and that's because I have to get the story out as fast as possible. Because if I do spend too much time like outlining and overthinking it, it will kill the story for me, which is kind of a pantser thing. But that's why what we said at the beginning, it's a spectrum, and we're a lot more related and closer than like the far ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, I would say, like, I don't think I'm a fast drafter, but I don't think I spend too much time outlining. Like, it's my pre-writing could be like, a week trying to figure it out, just like kind of playing around. But when I outline, it's like a day, if that. A couple hours, I sit down and I write out the outline, and then I'm ready to go.
Yeah, same for me. For my current project, I spent like 3 days in the pre-writing stage, and 1 full day was just doing character names. So, it's a very fast process. And then I spent 5 weeks writing the first draft. It's not as rigid or as like prepared as one might think when they hear that I have a 27-point outline.
See, what's interesting to me is I have to let myself percolate for a pretty long time compared to what you guys just described. So for my thriller, for example, I needed a full 8 weeks of percolation. And on my fantasy stuff, which requires more world building, oh gosh, it can be more like years. And I don't mean that in a dramatic way. I'm writing other things, but there's certain things I have where the pieces don't snap into place where I'm able to pants them for a long time. Because there is kind of it's hard to describe. Like, I know when it clicks into place, and sometimes it's way more information that I have to know ahead of time, and other times it's less, and it just depends.
I mean, I do some of that too. It's like the ideas on the back burner. Like, before I can jump into an outline, sometimes I am like just brainstorming and like playing around with ideas for a very long time. Again, my current project, I did my pre-writing stage in like 3 days, but I had like mashed together a couple of ideas, and the earliest one was like 2 years old. I had this one spark of a plot twist I was interested in doing, but the story didn't come together until more recently. I was like, oh, I can mash these tropes and this dynamic in with this plot twist. That's the story. Let's outline that real quick and then write it immediately before I lose my momentum here.
Well, I think this is a good time to discuss some of the other types of writing, and I've definitely found that I prefer some of these terms or definitions, and I suspect that we, as writers, have points of convergence on several of these, far better than plotting versus pantsing. One of my favorite ones is discovery writing, and I think both plotters and pantsers can be discovery writers, where you are discovering the story as you write it. And this is how I really think of pantsing. I thrive off of the discovery of character and story and conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I love outlining so much, because that's the discovery phase for me.
And then another one, this is kind of a subcategory of pantsing, different kinds of pantsers, which is a headlights writer, which means that you figure out, it's like you're in a car, and you figure out just enough that you can see ahead of you. And this is pretty accurate to me as well, meaning I'll know 1 or 2 scenes ahead. Not always, but usually. And it's just enough. And what I like about headlights writing as well is that it's you don't become as overwhelmed by the enormity of an entire novel this way, or at least I am less overwhelmed, which I think is one of the many reasons I'm a pantser. And it's just like, gosh, however I am capable of writing is how I'm going to write a book, because writing a book is so hard. But I really like headlights writing because it enables me to take the story in unexpected directions without worrying about it too much.
Right, because you're just planning ahead for like just the immediate future.
Yeah. But it can also get real bad when the headlights stop working. I'm like banging on the dashboard. I'm like, where am I?
Or
It's dark here.
Accidentally drive off a cliff because you didn't see it coming in time.
Get stuck in the snow. You don't see me for months. It's fine.
So does that happen to you often? Like, do you often find that you've gone down the wrong path and you have to backtrack? Or does having like your midpoint turn and like your vague idea of breaking into the third act, does that help guide you enough that you don't backtrack as much?
It's kept me going decently enough. What is more likely to happen, my skeleton almost never changes, but I have to rearrange organs a lot. So I have
to do that too.
I have consistently discovered something really cool in my third act that's forced me to rewrite major portions of acts 1 and 2, but I don't mind because it's part of the process. I find it kind of exciting.
Right.
Yeah, I always feel like this is like, I guess, kind of talking about revision, but I always have the same soul of the story, but I'm always changing it and making it different. Even though I'm rewriting a lot, it's still following the same end game almost. It's still, the soul is still the same.
I totally get what you're saying. The soul stays the same, but how the story looks at the end of it might be wildly different from how it looked at the beginning. But like that same soul and heart is still there.
Yeah, I think of it like a thread. There's still something threading through the novel that speaks to the heart of what I intended to write, but I might change like special elements. I don't know, bring in new fabrics, weird metaphors that, you know, they make it click into place, and that's what makes it work. And I discover it either late in my drafting process or in revision most often. And it's just a part of my process I've discovered. And I happen to love revision, and I think I'm pretty good at it, which complements pantsing, because I do think a major downside of it, you do have to do more editing, typically.
So let's talk a little bit about architects versus gardeners. Alexa, do you want to explain a little bit about what this is?
Yes. This is George R.R. Martin's answer to a better way to define plotters versus pantsers. And it's one that definitely has spoken to me and I like a lot. The idea is that architects have blueprints from which they build their beautiful houses, and gardeners plant seeds and then help them to grow. And I love the planting metaphor. I definitely... I start with seeds. I have something, but maybe I'm going to change my fertilizer or something. I like the idea as well because it makes the whole writing process sound so organic and beautiful on both sides.
Lainey, do you identify with either architect or gardener?
Well, I mean, I guess I feel like I'm both. See, that's why I also like to use the term road mapper, is because I don't know if this is a real term or not. I started using it a couple years ago, but I have like an idea of what's happening, what's going on, but I'm willing to make many detours and pit stops along the way.
I'd say that's actually a metaphor that also speaks to me. I just probably have a less well-formed map at the beginning. I have less of a plan than maybe you do, but I like the roadmap, the idea that you're taking a road trip.
There's scenes that I will write in my drafting stage that are not part of my outline. They're just, I want to explore that. Something must have happened in the scene where I'm like, oh, that's kind of fun. Maybe I should do this instead. So it does rearrange my outline, even though I'm still generally going in that direction. But I think that's important for my writing process, is that even though you have a structure and you're still following an outline, because if I don't, then I get stuck. But I'm willing to have like that pantsing kind of moment and do something that's totally not what I planned at all.
Mm-hmm. So I have some thoughts on the architect versus gardener thing, and I've talked about this a little bit in a video that Alexa and I actually did on my channel about plotting versus pantsing. But I fancy myself a sculptor, where I start with like a big hunk of stone, and I know what it's gonna be. I know the story that is in there. and I am just like chipping away at stone and trying to get to that story. And like I also jump around a lot when I'm writing, so this really works for me because like if I were doing a sculptor, I could like really finely sculpt and refine the head of whatever of this person I'm sculpting. But like the rest of it might just be like a big hunk of rock still that's like not really defined, but I have the head very defined or something. And I also work a lot in layers. So like I would do like one layer of like a very rough sculptor of like just doing the rough outline of a body and then start refining certain parts of it. And yeah, I think that's a nice little medium because I don't feel like I'm quite an architect. Like I think that's a little bit too intense of planning. I need some more leeway. So I like the idea of sculpting and like uncovering the story as I go, even though I know basically what it's going to be from the beginning, but the details surprise me along the way.
So what are your guys' experiences with outlining plotting? Have you always been one or the other, or have you kind of changed over time?
I've always been an outliner, but I've gotten much better at it. Like in the beginning, I did, for my first book, I did do a very vague outline. It was similar to yours, Lainey, where it was just like half a page of bullet points. Like I knew generally what the story was going to be. But I have definitely refined it, mostly as I've gotten a better sense for story structure.
I tried so hard to be an outliner. Well, because in the rest of my life, I'm a pretty rigid planner. In all other aspects of my life, I really love structure. And also just because I think overwhelmingly in writing circles, people mostly talk about outlining and prioritize outlining and like put it forth as like the way to write books. So I thought, well, this is how I write a book. I will outline it. And so I tried and kind of failed, but the thing that I kind of did on my first book was I did a story curve. And this is something I found on Jim Butcher's live journal. It's still there. It's a really good post. And he basically said that when he starts a story, he takes a blank piece of paper and he literally draws a bell curve on it, a story curve. And like he had an example of like where the inciting incident should fall and the midpoint and so on. And I did kind of use points on a bell curve to kind of arc out the story for my first novel, and it helped me to start and to try. But what's so funny is I still messed it up. I had so much revision to do on that book, but in fairness, first books. And then I don't think I even, after that, I don't think I tried to outline. I kind of, writing your first book will teach you how you best write a book. And even though I didn't have a name for it yet, I kind of was gravitating towards less planning. But, so I guess I've always in my heart been a pantser, even though I didn't know what it was. But in terms of evolving, as you know, I am trying. Because I do think that some books require more planning than others. So I'm trying.
Yeah,
that's
I
all
agree.
that matters.
I think it does really depend on the book and the story and the genre. Like if you're writing an epic high fantasy that's very sprawling and has a lot of characters, outlining probably is a better option just so you have more of a plan. Or if you're writing a thriller, outlining tends to be helpful in that. But if you're writing a contemporary or a paranormal, then pantsing might be easier, like especially for a contemporary. Like you can just really jump in there.
My experiences with outlining and everything else, I never was able to finish a book until I outlined it. So now that I have like more experience, I have more books underneath my belt, I tried doing that recently where I was kind of pantsing my current book that I'm drafting, and I realize I have to go back to outlining it because I'm right now at the point in...
Let me guess, it's Act 2. It's always Act 2.
Yep, I'm currently I'm about 40,000 words in, and I'm like, I don't know where I'm going, and I feel like I'm writing a lot of filler.
Welcome to chaos, Lainey. This is where I live.
Yeah, so this morning, actually, I had to be like, okay, I need to rein this all in, and I had to do some plot points in my notebook, which is, I guess we talked about that. A lot of pre-planning from all my pre-writing is done in a notebook. And I had a bullet point, the big reveals that had to happen still. And now I'm like, okay, now I got to rearrange them and try to figure out the order of them. Because, I'm writing like a book that's based on a bet, which is like my favorite trope from the 90s. So
thumbs up.
Yeah, so at least I have kind of like that structure. So I'm like, I know how bets go. They're going to have to get found out eventually. So I'm like trying to figure out the right order.
The timing.
The timing and so that made me realize this morning, I'm like, nope, I'm definitely someone who needs to have some kind of direction, because I'm at that point right now where I'm all over the place and I can't pants. So
what's funny is I'm also at that point in my book.
Same.
And I don't know, I'm feeling energized.
Oh, so. I'm not. I'm ready to just, once I get past the midpoint turn, I think that will re-energize me. But I'm still building up to it right now, and I'm just like, oh.
Yeah, I just finished a sexy game of hide and seek, so I'm like, I gotta get back to the less of the fun and games plot point and get back to the actual plot.
So, similar to Lainey, I had a lot of trouble finishing projects before I got really good at outlining. Because one thing that I would do is I would fall back on revising as I go. You know, I wouldn't quite know where exactly I was building to, where exactly I was going. So I would end up like rereading a lot of what I had already written and working on that and trying to perfect that. And I would end up stalling out a lot and kind of losing my passion for the story because I was just kept going over it and never finishing it. Which I think can bring us to another interesting discussion about like what are the pros and cons of pantsing and plotting. Because like we mentioned earlier that one con of plotting is that you can kind of lose your passion for the story because you're kind of beating it to death at the outlining stage. So yeah, let's talk about that. Alexa, do you have some pros and cons of pantsing?
Oh, do I? And these pros and cons are going to really vary depending on the person. Though I think the cons are a bit more universal. So a pro for me, of course, is just it makes writing really fun. Part of the reason I fall to this style is that it injects a lot of joy into my writing because the flying by the seat of the pants, it's exhilarating. And it's one of the few areas where in my life where I enjoy having less control and kind of being spontaneous. I am not a spontaneous person. I think that's a major pro. It can inject a lot of excitement into the writing process. I think it's a pro that because of this, if you're good at pantsing, there's good and bad to both sides. Mm-hmm. It can lead to a very unexpected story. It can go in really unexpected directions. But then the con is, I mentioned you have to do more editing. You do, because often this will mess with continuity, with character arcs. It needs to still feel like a cohesive story. So you have to do more work to kind of thread it all together. But if you're good at it, it can lead to a really exciting story.
Right.
I also think that pantsing benefits character-driven work a lot more. I think if you're pantsing, your plots are more likely to be meandering. At least for me, this is personal. A huge part of pantsing for me is discovering character. And so I find that it benefits my character-driven stories, personally. I think a huge con of pantsing is that in the hands of a novice, in the hands of someone who doesn't have as much writing experience, storytelling experience, and as firm a grasp on elements of craft, it is more likely to fall apart. It is more likely that you won't write a good, cohesive story. And also, if you are less experienced, you're more likely to give up. I do think pantsing leads to stagnation, especially in that second act. As we were talking about, all of us hit hurdles in our middle. And unless you're experienced as a pantser, it's so easy to just die.
Yeah, it gets so overwhelming. And it just
having no
broken.
idea what's going to happen. Exactly. So for me, like, those are the pros and cons as I see them.
And also, there's stigma against pantsing. Plotting is generally seen by a lot of people as like a good way to do it. Although there are cons to plotting, of course. But there is stigma against pantsing, and part of it is because a lot of novice writers will do it and will end up like meandering and not really know how to fix it and get through that. But it is absolutely possible to pants an amazing story.
Absolutely. And I think part of this is that just a majority of professional writers do outline. I think those who don't, the pantsers, the less outliney, don't speak up as much. They aren't quite as loud. People aren't quite as aware of them as pantsers, though we're going to talk about some famous plotters versus pantsers. And I think that exactly that stigma does come from it being, well, I'm just going to fly by the seat of my pants and try novel writing is definitely a novice move. And I think what's important for people to realize is it's absolutely can be a professional writing style, though I will speak to the joys of a middle ground, the really hilarious term people use, which is plantsing. It's in between plotting and pantsing, and really I think that's where I fall, but it's easier to say you're a pantser.
I think that's where most people fall.
I agree. Yeah. Honestly, we have so much more in common than we think.
We do.
We're all the same, except we're not, but we are.
Yeah, I think part of the stigma also comes from outlining tends to be easier to teach. Like there are lots of ways to, write out the plot points and like guide people on how to outline. But pantsing is a very individualized, like just figuring it out as you go kind of thing. Yeah. It's harder to teach that. Whereas outlining, I can give you, 9 points to like plot your story by. Whereas pantsing is just like, good luck, bro.
Well, but that's another reason why I encourage all writers to try outlining.
Oh, yeah. Because
it is something to follow. It is something to try. Yeah. And I think it is the way to develop a cohesive, coherent pantsing style or non-outlining style.
Yeah, I think it's very important to study story structure, whether you're a pantser, a plotter, a plantser, wherever you fall on the spectrum. Having a good grasp of like the basic flow of a story, inciting incident, first plot twist, midpoint turn, plot twist, darkest night of the soul, power within, climax, resolution. Like having that general groundwork is really valuable, and just being familiar with that. But you don't need to plot. You don't need to pants. You can find your own method at either side of the spectrum or in between.
And the other reason I do like to talk about being a pantser, even though I probably am a plantser, is I think there are just so many writers out there who are struggling, who think that they're broken and incapable of writing a novel because they keep trying and trying and trying to write novels the way they're told they should, which is you outline, you do extensive planning, you figure out your entire plot before you start writing. And I mostly like to scream loudly about it just so that more people will take a chance, will step off the cliff, because it's possible outlining isn't working because you're not born to be an outliner. And I want more writers to try.
And also there is that stigma. So I feel like some pantsers might be kind of ashamed to admit they are a pantser because they feel like that, they're not doing it the right way. They're not an outliner. And that's like seen as like the standard in a lot of traditional publishing circles.
Which you just reminded me of a big con. It can be very hard to be a pantser in traditional publishing because they tend to like you to submit a proposal for future work, which means you have to outline, you have to figure out your story ahead of time, and it is tough, which for me personally means I have to write a complete book before I submit things.
Right. You haven't submitted a proposal?
Well, I did for my second book, and it turned out fine, but it is hilarious because the synopsis I turned in is not the final book. It worked out, but my poor publisher, they're like, what? Yeah, to give you an idea, so the proposal I turned in was just persuasion in space, and there was no bachelorette plot line, which is now literally the driving force of the novel. it worked out, but it's kind of funny.
I do have some pros and cons of outlining. So,
yes,
for me, like, I guess all this is personal, like my personal pros and cons. So my pro is that it'll always ensure me that I'll finish a book. I've never finished a book without one. However, the flip side of that is my con, which is I not really tend or officially outline wrong, but since my revision has swaths of rewriting, there's an element there to me that says I didn't outline this correctly because I'm changing so much of what I had followed. So I don't know, it's like I can't finish without one, but it forces me to have more work in the revision. I'm doing more work in the revision then.
So really, it sounds like you can do a lot of revising either way.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I have rewritten one of my projects, Storyteller, several times because I had to recast a character, a central character, like completely change them, which, you know, I could outline the plot as much as I want, but a lot of character is done in a pantsing sort of way. Like, you need to see how it plays out on page, these dynamics, which I know, let's jump into famous plotters and pantsers, because kind of related to this. I know Brandon Sanderson is a plotter, but he only plots like the story beats. He discovery writes his characters, so he'll have like a thorough, detailed outline for like what is going on in the story, but then the characters, he kind of just pantses that and just discovery writes how they interact with each other and how they interact with his planned story beats.
Another famous plotter is J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter. I don't have you know so much about Brandon Sanderson. I don't know as much about J.K.R., but I will say, reading Harry Potter, I'm not surprised she plotted those all out. You can kind of feel it.
Yeah, because the Harry Potter books are
they're mysteries.
They're mysteries.
Yeah.
So she needed to like kind of plot that out.
Yeah.
And I've seen some of her plotting materials. Like, she's shared a couple pages of like how she plotted, and it's like this spreadsheet almost, except it's on paper. It's like just a grid of like what is happening in each chapter, like what each character is doing in each chapter. Like,
I'm gonna tap out.
She really thought it out. Yeah.
Another one that I found is John Grisham, who said the more detailed his outline, the easier it is to write the book. And again, he writes kind of mystery thrillers, legal thrillers.
Right.
Completely makes sense to me that he has to outline those. And then finally, I a really good YA example, because we have two YA examples in either category that I think fall in the middle. And Leigh Bardugo definitely considers herself a plotter, an outliner. She uses a 12-point outline, but what she does that I think is interesting, it's very similar to you, Kat. She dirty drafts. She does a fast draft 0 that is very short. It's not the complete book. And then she does way more writing and development on the next draft, which is definitely a style that a lot of writers use.
Yeah, because one big con of outlining is that you can kind of get tired of the story by planning it ahead of time. And so I found that dirty drafts, fast drafting, whatever you want to call it, that method really works for me to not get tired of it. You know, if I can outline in a couple of days and jump immediately into a NaNoWriMo pace fast draft, that's the best way for me to complete a draft. And my rough drafts, my draft 0s, I sometimes call them, do tend to be about half the length of what the finished book will be. Like my current project, I completed it at just about 50,000 words, but as I am halfway through revisions now, I see that it's going to be a 100,000 word novel. So I am adding quite a bit in my revisions.
See, that's always interesting. I'm always fascinated when people write their quick drafts or their fast drafts and they're like only 50,000 words, because I'm like the complete opposite. I can't help but write so much in my first draft. My first drafts are always 90 to 100,000 words.
Wow.
Like, it's insane. I don't know why. I wish I wasn't like this, but I am.
I feel like that tends to be more of a pantser thing, to have like really long drafts. Because I know my friend Christine, her initial draft was like super long because she was a pantser and she had some scenes that ended up not really going anywhere and needed to be cut. Because like, I mean, I guess it varies for outlining and pantsing, whether you're an overwriter or an underwriter. But I'm definitely an underwriter.
Yeah, and I should say, I'm similar, Lainey. And the thing is, even though I'm a pantser, I'm very deliberate. I don't tend to write quickly, though I'm trying to work on that, to be honest. I desire to fast draft. But my dirty drafts, even if I call them that, they're actually pretty thorough. Because I have to write every nook and cranny of the character moments and scenes and beats in order to figure stuff out. Thus, my drafts do tend to be longer. And I mentioned moving organs around a skeleton. I move the organs less than you'd expect. There's always vital organs, so to speak, that stay in the same place, even if I do a lot of rewriting. So, like threading my Bachelorette plotline through my second book, yeah, it was a lot of work, and it changed some very specific chapters and scenes and beats and arcs in Act 1 and Act 2. But a shocking amount of the book really did more or less stay the same. So I like the combination of flying by the seat of my pants technically, but I'm still really deliberate. So
your first drafts tend to be fairly clean, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like from a grammar, usage, and prose standpoint, yeah.
Yeah, see, mine are not. Grammar is completely optional in my zero drafts.
That would kill me.
No, I don't use dialogue tags at all, or even quotation marks most of the time. A lot of my zero drafts reads like a screenplay.
Jaws are dropping.
I don't write I don't write a lot of descriptions in my zero drafts, so I'll have to go back and I have white room syndrome everywhere. So my entire book takes place in one white room. So yeah, I have to go back, and a lot of it is adding dialogue tags and just generally fleshing things out, because I'll have a sentence like, they walk into the room, and then I have to unpack that and make it a couple sentences of them actually walking into the room.
Okay, this is where it's Team Lainey Alexa versus Team Kat. Your process is so different.
Yeah, I'm so thorough, and maybe that's my problem, since I throw out almost all of it in the revision. But
that's interesting how plotter or pantser, you can still be thorough or not thorough. There's all different spectrums, different ways to do it. Yeah.
We're all the same, except we're really not.
We're really not. Yeah, it's interesting, though.
But we all end up with books. And so just briefly, some famous pantsers. This is my rebuttal to, I was listening to a podcast, and there was a writing expert on this podcast who was saying some great things about writing, and I was really vibing with it. And then they said that if you don't outline, if you don't plan everything ahead of time, you're not a writer. That writers who do this, professional writers who do this, don't exist. And I was so upset. I was screaming at my podcast, Holly Black and Stephen King. So those are two famous pantsers who write amazing books that we all love, and they are unrepentant pantsers. We do exist.
I did not know that either of them were pantsers.
Holly, she was talking about her writing process at a book talk I went to for Cool Prince, and I just felt so seen. I didn't know she was a pantser until then, but she was describing, she goes on writing retreats with Cassie Clare, and Holly will go in not knowing anything, and I'm like, I feel so, it was a big moment for me. I felt great because The Cruel Prince is so good. And reading that book, you would not guess that was pants.
Yeah, Holly Black is one of my favorite authors. I love her. I wouldn't have guessed that she was a pantser.
She does a lot of revision. But she talked about the trouble not being able to tell her publisher what the book is before she writes it. And I'm like, mood. Hardcore mood. And and then the other YA crossover author worth talking about, to me kind of the opposite of Leigh Bardugo, but kind of meeting in the middle. I've heard V.E. Schwab talk about her writing process, and I do believe she's evolved a bit. I think she's had to do more outlining as she's had more books, but the last time I heard her talk about it, she said that she has 6 to 9 plot points and nothing else when she starts. And I'm like, that sounds very relatable to me.
Yeah,
Like,
what I've heard of her process is that she's a connect the dots writer.
Yes.
So she also writes out of order, which is
I
interesting.
can't.
Because, yeah, you
cringed.
can't do that, but I do that. I can't write chronologically. But yeah, so she'll like write scenes out of order and then work on connecting them and making them flow into a cohesive story.
She also starts with the ending, and I believe Lee Bardugo does as well. So that's another different process thing. We could just talk about all the wacky things that writers do.
Yeah. See, to me, the most famous pantser is George R.R. Martin. Like, he is notorious for being a pantser, a gardener, as he puts it.
Which shocks me.
Yeah, but doesn't that just lead us down this current path where is he ever gonna write another book?
Well, I'm still astounded because, like I mentioned earlier, like if you're writing an epic high fantasy that's very sprawling and has a lot of points of view, like that's probably best suited to outlining. But George R.R. Martin does not outline, and that like blows my mind.
Boom.
Yeah.
I think really the lesson is that it takes all sorts, and there are distinctions between different groups, but there's clearly no one way to write a book.
Yeah, every process is valid. Like whether you're an outliner, a pantser, a plantser, whether you write out of order or chronologically, whether your drafts are very messy or very clean, like whatever works for you. It's really about finding your own process that you can do.
Yeah, I think the most important part is that there's no right way to write a book.
Right.
It's just kind of finding what best works for you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and then I think the other common point we all are coming back to is revision.
Right.
There's so much work every writer needs to do in revision. No book is a first draft. Mm-hmm. And you can find the story in revisions, you can fix the story in revisions, you can rewrite the story in revisions. Meaning it's not all live or die by your first draft and the process of writing that first draft.
Yeah. And also your process can change from project to project, and it often does.
Now it is time for our Patreon question of the week from Annette. They ask, so I'm wondering, setting-wise, how specific do you think a book can get with real places? I've seen plenty of books name drop bigger cities and use them as settings, but what if it's a smaller town?
I think you can absolutely name drop a smaller town, or you can make up a town, use a big city. Like I think it really comes down to what works for the book. If it's a smaller town that you're not familiar with and you've never been to, then you might want to do a lot of research to make sure that you are getting that experience as accurate as possible, because anyone from that town is going to be able to tell if it doesn't resonate as real to them. Like I've read several books where they are set in like a small town in Northern California, and as someone who lives in a small town in Northern California, I feel like they didn't do enough research for that, because I'm like, where is this where is this place? Like, have you been to Northern California ever?
I felt that with big cities too, and I think ultimately, can a writer really win? Oh, the one that gets me is I can always tell when someone sets something in Boston, if they've never lived in Boston / aren't actually from Boston. You can tell, and I think that there are different ways to approach it. First of all, in a lot of contemporary fiction, you can't get away with just making up places. And I think that's why you see more big name cities, because people are going to think it's weird. They're going to be like, why? If you make up a big city, like an important place, they're going to assume it's fantasy. And then I think with small towns, I actually think I err on the side of making up a place, only because if you do base it on a real place, you could potentially get into weird water with like, are you basing it off real people and etc. But it really depends. So I can say in my current book, I made up a school. So the private school, I invented it so that I wouldn't get into weird hot water with any real private schools in lieu of a town. So it's not a town, it's a school. But I do mention a real town in the state of Massachusetts specifically so that readers know it is in Massachusetts. So that's kind of the line that I walked on that. It's just a personal choice.
That's interesting. That's exactly what I did. Like, I made up a boarding school in Northern California because that's where I live. And I'm still on the fence about whether or not I'm going to make up like the neighboring city names or if I'm going to use actual city names. Like right now it's a made up name, but I might use a real name. But yeah, I made up a boarding school.
This is why I don't write contemporary. Because I just don't know. But there was this romance book I read a couple years ago that was set in Iowa, which is where I'm from. And they used real names. And it was so specific, some of the smaller towns that they referenced. And obviously the bigger cities are the most familiar. Where I had to look up the author. Because I'm like, there's no way that they wrote this and they weren't from Iowa. And they were. So I don't know, like, I feel like you're going to know your area the best, but obviously you don't have to write about the area you're from, but it's going to come off more authentic if you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I chose to set this particular book, at least currently, in Massachusetts, not because I've lived in Western Massachusetts, because I have not, but because I lived in Boston for such a long time that I do feel like I can nail the feel of the landscape and the people better.
I mean, even with bigger cities, I can tell if an author is writing about Los Angeles or New York and has never actually been there, because it's a more like Hollywood version of these big cities, and they don't actually get the heart of the cities. So if you're going to use real places, I would say just do a lot of research and make sure that they are as accurate as you can make them, because people from those real places might, your setting might not resonate with them if you have a lot of inaccuracies.
I would find a beta reader from the place. That helps.
Or you can just make up cities.
Yeah.
I did do that for my urban fantasy. I made up a place. But I will say, even if you're using a fake name, I always still base them on real places. Like, I creeped around some boarding school websites because I'm creepy. But making up one enabled me to pick and choose from different elements of different schools that I liked, without people being like, but that's not XYZ Academy. Or with the towns in my urban fantasy, I based the architecture and landscape off of a real town in a real place. But then I'd created a fake name. So.
Yeah.
There was this project that I didn't finish a few years ago that was a contemporary, and it was based in a different country. Well, not really based, but they go to this different country. And what I did was I went on Google Maps and I did the street view, and I just kind of walked through. It was Spain. I was walking through Barcelona just to get the architecture, the feel, just everything that was visual. I was really trying to soak that up, and I got that from Marissa Meyer, who said she did that for the Lunar Chronicles. A pro tip for that was for her to go to Google Maps and kind of explore the city that way, even if she couldn't go.
I have definitely done that before.
I would also say, if it's a big city, different country that you haven't been to, watch some travel vlogs on YouTube, because that can give you an interesting perspective of someone actually visiting that area.
And I will also say that at a certain point, you can't twist yourself up too much, because one person's experience of a place is going to be different from another person's experience of a place. I had a book that I read. It was set in London, and I could tell this person had been there. They picked a very specific area where I happened to live for a year. And it felt both accurate and off to me at the same time. So I don't think you can win. I can tell this person has been there, but I suspect it was for a week.
Right. Oh, and what's interesting? Stephanie Meyer, she had never been to Forks when she wrote about Forks.
And aren't they glad how she transformed their economy forever?
I mean, I've heard, though, that it is very accurate to her descriptions. People who lived in Forks were like, this feels very real. So, she really did her research there.
Yeah. All right, that is our episode. Again, thank you to all our patrons for your support. You can check out our page at patreon.com/NovelTea where our patrons can suggest topics, ask questions, and vote in polls.
We also broadcast live shows on YouTube. You can subscribe to our channel, NovelTea Show, and you can also follow us on Twitter at NovelTea Show for updates and announcements.
If you like this podcast, please subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice. And we'd really appreciate it if you can rate and review us on iTunes and Google Play. Doing so helps bump us up in the ratings and helps other listeners find us. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, happy writing.